Hello everyone. My topic for today is carcinoma ovary. I'll be covering the topic under these headings: epidemiology, risk factors, pathology and pathogenesis, diagnosis, screening and staging. So ovarian cancer, it is one of the most treatable solid tumors, as majority will usually respond to surgery and cytotoxic agents. So most commonly we encounter tumors of the ovary, like they'll be epithelial tumors, germ cell or sex cord stromal origin. Epithelial is most in postmenopausal women, germ cell tumors in younger age group, and sex cord stromal tumors we can see at any age. 80 to 90% of the ovarian cancers is epithelial in origin. So this is the fifth most frequent cancer in women worldwide and fifth leading cause of cancer death in women in the US. These are some statistics which are not very important. In India, as we see, it's like the third common site of malignancy in women is ovary after breast and cervix. Okay, so the overall 5-year survival rate is about 45%. It is called the silent killer. Why? Because it is asymptomatic in the early stages. Usually, when an ovarian mass is diagnosed or if the patient starts having complaints, it is usually in the end stage. So, 75% are diagnosed with an advanced stage disease. At that time, the 5-year survival usually will be 10 to 28%. A woman's lifetime risk of developing sporadic epithelial ovarian cancer is around 1.7% in a developed nation and slightly lesser in India. So dying from ovarian cancer is around 1.1%. So you can see by this that it is not a very common entity. So 25% of the ovarian tumors usually are malignant. Approximately 80% of them are primary growths of the ovary, the remainder being secondary. So the median age and diagnosis for the cancer is around 60 years for sporadic. In case a genetic predisposition or a genetic mutation is there in the patient, then maybe in the 4th or the 5th decade, that is around 40 to 50 years, it is diagnosed. And only 10 to 15% of them in the premenopausal age group, they are diagnosed. So coming to the risk factors of ovarian malignancy, the age of the woman, usually it is around 50 or 60 years, usually around the perimenopausal or the postmenopausal age group. And factors like early menarche, nulliparity or age more than 30 at the first childbirth, and late menopause. Certain fertility drugs like prolonged use of clomiphene citrate, especially without achieving pregnancy, you're continuously stimulating the ovaries to produce multiple follicles. So the stromal damage, the epithelial damage which occurs due to these drugs can predispose to malignancy. And personal history of breast cancer in the patient, or family history of breast cancer or ovarian cancer in the family, like first degree relatives, that means there is some genetic mutation which is predisposing to malignancy in this particular patient. Hormone replacement therapy for more than 10 years is said to have an increased risk, around 30% associated increased risk of developing malignancy. And some studies also say the use of talcum powder, not established though. So causes of hereditary susceptibility. Now ovarian malignancy is one such cancer where importance has to be given to a hereditary genetic mutations which occur, because these are patients where early screening is done, where early treatment is done. You have to catch these patients at the earliest and treat them prophylactically, saying that now even if they don't have ovarian malignancy, in the future they can, or there is a high chance they will develop. Therefore we have to treat them at the earliest. So in mutations like we have BRCA1, BRCA2 and HNPCC and undiscovered single genes. So hereditary causes usually account for about 10% of the ovarian malignancies normally which we see. Out of that, 75% of them are usually due to BRCA1 and the remaining are as per the percentages given. So the importance is, see, BRCA1 and 2 genes are associated cancers, like they are cancers of the breast because of genetic mutations. And these two genes are usually present on chromosome 17 and chromosome 13 respectively. They are required for the normal proliferation of the cells, and they kind of mm, they help in proper proliferation of the cells. In case any mutation occurs in them, it tends to a malignant change. So breast cancer 40 to 85% often occur at an early age, and contralateral breast cancer also can occur in 40 to 60%. That means bilateral breasts can be involved in such patients, and in them ovarian cancer is about 15 to 40%. And in men, risk of breast cancer is elevated. In some studies suggest that the risks of prostatic and pancreatic cancer can also be elevated. So in such patients who have BRCA1 and 2 mutations, what we do is, such patients, when they have complaints of the breast, along with treating the breast cancer, we prophylactically remove the ovaries and the tubes in such patients. Or you can go for a direct hysterectomy also, but always remember that prophylactically it is wise to remove the ovaries and the tubes. So, greater risk for developing ovarian cancer in such patients. Overall, they have superior outcomes compared with patients who do not possess these mutations. The theory behind this observation is the same genetic defect that increases the risk of cancer prevents already malignant cells from repairing the damage induced by agents such as platinum. So, HNPCC or Lynch syndrome, around 7% of the hereditary ovarian cancers are due to HNPCC. Responsible genes like mismatch repair genes, including MLH1, MSH2, and MSH6 genes. Increased incidence of other adenocarcinomas like stomach, small intestines, and bile duct malignancies. So, what are the protective factors for ovarian cancer? First of all, multiparity. First pregnancy before the age of 30, then oral contraceptives. 5 years use of oral contraceptive, it cuts down the risk to nearly half. That means 50% reduced chance of getting ovarian malignancy. Tubal ligation, hysterectomy, bilateral oophorectomy at an early age because of, say, any other disease. There was bilateral ovarian cysts, recurrent cysts, dermoid, etc. If you have removed, then there is a reduced risk of ovarian malignancy by 80 to 95%. And lactation, proper lactation in the postpartum period reduces the risk of malignancy. Epidemiologic and laboratory evidence suggests that a potential role of retinoids or vitamin D or NSAIDs can be preventive agents for ovarian cancers. So pathogenesis is role of ovulation, that is continuous ovulation, like say in when we give ovulation induction drugs. In these patients there is higher risk of getting malignancy because there is a repetitive process of DNA damage, inflammation, and repair of the surface epithelium in them, therefore leading to malignancy eventually. And epithelial ovarian neoplasms are thought to arise from the surface epithelium covering the ovary. Why? Because during multiple ovulations there is repair. The surface epithelium tends to repair itself, and when it is repairing itself, there are high chances of it metastasizing or metaplasing to form other glands, other cysts, etc., therefore leading to malignancy at a later stage. And the epithelium via neoplastic transformation also has the ability or may show certain features of transforming into other epithelial tissues. Like in cases of serous epithelial tumors, it has a lining of a fallopian tube. In mucinous, it can have gastrointestinal mucosa or endocervical mucosa. In cases of endometrioid ovarian tumors, it can be it can be like an endometrial gland. Like Brenner or transitional tumors can have a lining of the bladder, like that. So, ovarian carcinogenesis can be divided into two broad phases. One is malignant transformation, where from a benign it goes to borderline and then malignant, or it can be due to peritoneal dissemination. So, the newer model of ovarian carcinogenesis is surface epithelial tumors are divided into two, that is type 1 and type 2, based on the clinicopathologic features and characteristic molecular genetic changes. So this is a newer classification, not classification, it is a categorization. Like usually ovarian tumors are now categorized as type 1 or type 2. So what is type 1? Type 1 tumors are usually low grade. They arise from precursor lesion in a stepwise fashion. They typically present in stage 1 They are slow growing, indolent, often remains low grade. Like example, mucinous, clear cell, endometrioid. In high grade, they are type 2. High grade, they arise de novo, that is from the ovarian stroma, and they are typically present in the advanced stage. They are rapid growing, very aggressive. And molecular biologic evidence supports a dualistic model of ovarian carcinogenesis. Like they say that high grade serous carcinomas are because of P53 mutations, whereas low grade are because of KRAS mutations or BRAF genes. And very recently, Lee et al. Has proposed that many high grade serous carcinomas actually arise in the fimbria of the fallopian tube. So the origin is from the fimbria of the fallopian tube and it spreads onto the ovary. That is why when we prophylactically do a hysterectomy or say oophorectomy, it is mandatory to remove the fallopian tubes. Never leave the fallopian tubes, because that is the origin of the malignancy. That is what, as per recent studies, they say that 80% of the ovarian carcinomas which are epithelial in origin, they arise from the fallopian tube. Even if you are leaving the ovary in a patient, never leave the fallopian tube. So the pathological classification, like we know, 65 to 70% of them are epithelial tumors. Germ cell tumors account for about 15 to 20%, and stromal tumors about 5 to 10%. So this is the WHO classification of ovarian neoplasms. You can get it in any textbook. Kindly go through it. So the surface epithelial tumors, most common tumors, they can be serous, mucinous, endometrioid, transitional cell or clear cell. So surface epithelial tumors, like when they are benign, they are mostly cystic. Microscopic fine papillae are there, single layer covering is there. No nuclear atypia, no stromal invasion. When they are borderline tumors, there can be some amount of solid foci. And papillary complexity is there, stratification, minimal to moderate nuclear atypia is there, no stromal invasion. Whereas if it is malignant, grossly solid with hemorrhage, necrosis, and stromal invasion, nuclear atypia, stratification. Okay. So serous tumors are frequently bilateral. 75% of them are benign, 25% are malignant. Tall columnar ciliated epithelium will be seen. And serous cystadenomas, there is single layer of ciliated columnar epithelium with fine papillae. In papillary cystadenoma, papillary complexity will be there, no stromal invasion will be there, nuclear stratification and atypia. Whereas in serous cystadenocarcinomas, there is stromal invasion and presence of Samoma bodies, often associated with CA125 elevation. In mucinous tumors, they are usually less common. Very large tumors, they are rarely bilateral. Most of the time it is unilateral. They have epithelium wise, they have tall columnar epithelium and there will be mucin present in them with pseudomyxoma peritoni. So mucinous cystadenoma, they are multilocular cysts lined by single layer of columnar cells with basally placed nuclei with an apical mucin. Mucinous cystadenoma borderline tumors, there is no stromal invasion. With the above features, there is no stromal invasion. Whereas in cystadenocarcinoma, there is papillary complexity with nuclear stratification and atypia and stromal invasion. CA125 in mucinous type may or may not be elevated. It is relatively chemoresistant, these tumors. And differential diagnosis of a mucinous ovarian tumors include metastatic disease from an appendiceal primary, from a primary appendix. So coming to endometrioid tumors, mostly they are unilateral, malignant. Many are associated with endometrial cancer and patients may have concurrent endometriosis. The histopath in these tumors will be the normal endometrium, that is endometrial glands will be there in the ovary, which is a diagnostic feature. So stromal invasion by irregular malignant endometrial glands. So coming to the FIGO staging for ovarian cancer, very important and should be known because the staging and the treatment is based on this particular FIGO staging. So I'll explain this in detail. So as we see, stage 1 ovarian cancer, it is limited to the ovaries only. Stage 1 is divided again to stage 1A, 1B and 1C. 1A is tumor is limited to one ovary, capsule is intact, no tumor on the ovarian surface, no malignant cells, no ascites, no peritoneal washing, no cells in the peritoneal washings. Stage 1B is tumor is limited to both the ovaries, but still the capsule is intact, no tumor on the ovarian surface, no malignant cells are seen in ascites or peritoneal washings. In stage 1C, tumor is either in one of the ovaries with any of the above, that is either capsule will be ruptured or tumor will be present on the ovarian cells or malignant cells will be seen in the ascites or peritoneal washings. So stage 2, tumor involving one or both ovaries with pelvic extension or implants. That is stage 2A is extension or implants on the uterus or fallopian tubes. No malignant cells in the ascites or peritoneal washings. In 2B, extension to the other pelvic tissues. No malignant cells in ascites or peritoneal washings. In stage 2C, pelvic extension will be there with malignant cells in ascites or peritoneal washings. Stage 3, tumors involving one or both ovaries with microscopically confirmed peritoneal implants outside the pelvis. So here the tumor has spread outside the pelvis, and in the ovaries it may be there or may not be. That is microscopic malignant cells might be there. Okay, so stage 3A is microscopic peritoneal metastasis beyond the pelvis. Stage 3B is macroscopic peritoneal metastasis less than 2 cm. 3C is peritoneal metastasis with greater than 2 cm of the tumor is seen outside the peritoneum. Outside the pelvis. And the stage 3C is with or without lymph node metastasis. Stage 4 is tumor involving one or both the ovaries with distant metastasis. Parenchymal liver metastasis equals stage 4. So distant metastasis can either be in the liver, bone, lung or the brain. So metastasis, the typical spread usually from an ovary, it can go to the omentum, peritoneal surfaces like the undersurface of the diaphragm, paracolic gutters, bowel serosa, and then lymphatics, it follows the blood supply of the ovary through the infundibulopelvic ligament to the para-aortic and the aortic regions. And drainage through the broad ligament and parametrium involves extension through the iliac, obturator and hypogastric regions. Along the round ligament, it involves the inguinal nodes and extra-abdominal metastasis like the pleura, liver, spleen, lung, bone, CNS. So ovarian cancer, the survival rate of ovarian cancer is usually if it is diagnosed in stage 1 and adequate treatment is given at the earliest, the chance of survival will be more than 90%. This is 5-year survival. And stage 2, it's around 70 to 80% of them. And stage 4, less than 5%. Overall, around, if good treatment is given, then 50% chance is that the patient can survive for at least 2 to 3 years. So diagnosis and clinical evaluation. 75 to 80% of the patients with epithelial ovarian cancer are diagnosed at the time when their disease has spread throughout the peritoneal cavity. That is in a late stage. So usually symptoms of ovarian cancer patient can be asymptomatic till the end. A large part of the disease, the patient will be asymptomatic only. She can come with certain vague complaints but frequent complaints. Like if a patient comes with certain symptoms like say abdominal bloating, enlargement or vomiting, bleeding, difficulty in eating, early satiety and urinary urgency or frequency, if she's coming with such symptoms very frequently, at least 12 to 15 times a month, then you have to evaluate the patient or you have to have a diagnosis of maybe a malignancy in mind. So the diagnostic tools, first is proper history taking, like if there is a mass that she has noticed, when any complaints associated with the mass, whether it has gradually progressed, whether it is painful, painless, and a proper pelvic examination has to be taken, including the rectal examination, transvaginal ultrasound, tumor markers, CT and MRI. So like unlike CA cervix where a proper examination has to be done because that is important for the staging, unlike that, over here a routine examination has to be done and supported with other investigations like say transvaginal ultrasound, tumor markers, CT and MRI, because here staging is through surgery, it is not clinical staging. Okay, so staging is through surgery, and unless and until we open the patient up and see till where the extension is, we cannot stage the malignancy. All other investigations just are supportive. So usually when we see for a physical examination, what we have to see, if it is a malignant mass, then it'll usually have irregular margins, it'll be solid, it'll be unilateral, sometimes bilateral, but we won't be able to make out per abdomen. So it can be unilateral, solid, it will not be mobile, and they can be associated ascites. So depending on the amount of ascites that we feel, we have to see whether for shifting dullness, puddle sign, etc. In menstruating women, only 5 to 18% of the adnexal masses will prove malignant, versus in postmenopausal women where up to 60% of the masses can be malignant. So when you find a mass, what else can it be? If she is not in the postmenopausal age group or perimenopausal age, what else can it be? First, rule out pregnancy. Secondly, endometrioma, fibroid or a functional cyst, any ectopic pregnancy, dermoid tumor in younger women. So an ultrasound, this is the initial imaging modality of choice for benign versus malignant. So the thing is with ultrasound, so usually a common question is asked whether in ultrasound you want to do a transvaginal ultrasound or a transabdominal ultrasound. The answer is it depends on the size of the mass. If it is a small mass per abdomen, when you cannot make out the size of the mass, then, but when you do a bimanual examination, you're feeling for some forniceal fullness, then you can do a transvaginal ultrasound and know the exact measures, which is more accurate. But if it is a huge mass, then a transabdominal ultrasound is to be done, because with transvaginal you cannot make out the surface of the mass, the contents of the mass. It will be seen, but because by then the mass will be an abdominal organ, so a transvaginal ultrasound at that point will not give you much result. So the answer should be that it depends on the size of the mass. So in ultrasound, it is first line of diagnostic measure. It has a very good negative predictive value. That means 99%, up to 99% negative predictive value in excluding a malignancy. So when you do an ultrasound, if it has a smooth wall, thin walls, fewer thin septations, absence of solid component or mural nodularity, you can be 95 to 99% sure that the patient does not have a malignant lesion. Whereas if there is a mural thickening or irregularity of the wall, solid components are there, thick septations of at least 3 millimeter in size, and associated findings like ascites, peritoneal implants, then these findings suggest malignancy. And use of a color or pulse Doppler, usually it is not very useful in ovarian masses, because if it is malignant, only thing is if it is malignant the blood supply will be more, so there may be high PI or high resistive index in Doppler, otherwise it has no significance. So as we see, a transvaginal ultrasound and a pelvic examination, the transvaginal ultrasound has higher detection rates compared to only a pelvic examination. So now we have found a mass, what next? So the question is, when you find a mass, if it has features, you categorize whether it is benign features or malignant features. If at all she is of a postmenopausal age group, a mass of more than 5 centimeters needs further evaluation. If she is of a perimenopausal age group, mass is around 5 centimeters, slightly less, then you ask for further blood investigations like tumor markers or CA-125. If at all those are normal, just follow up the patient. So if the mass is not suspicious, just follow up the patient. The mass should resolve over 2 months or so. Otherwise, the patient should be taken up for surgery, or further evaluation at least has to be done. And for a patient who is postmenopausal, the cyst size around 5 centimeters, definitely evaluate and go ahead with surgery. So in postmenopausal and asymptomatic with unilateral simple cyst of less than 5 centimeters, normal CA125 levels, you can still follow up the patient. All other postmenopausal women with an ovarian mass require surgical evaluation. So a CT scan, it is not the first study of choice to evaluate a suspected ovarian lesion. The sensitivity, specificity and accuracy of CT for categorizing whether benign versus malignant is usually, it is good, but it is not the first choice. Why? Because we have a cheaper modality like ultrasound which has very good negative predictive value. So if you are doubtful in an ultrasound, then you go ahead with a higher modality, otherwise not required. On CT, the ovarian cancer usually demonstrates varied morphologic patterns, including a multilocular cyst with thick internal septations, solid mural or septal components, and partially cystic and solid mass, and a lobulated papillary solid mass. So coming to MRI. MRI again, it is complementary to ultrasound in the evaluation of a suspected ovarian lesion. As with CT, disease metastatic to the ovary is often distinguishable from a primary ovarian cancer on MRI scans. Both colon and stomach should be examined as a potential primary tumor sites if an ovarian mass is detected. Several studies have compared MRI to CT and ultrasound for characterizing adnexal masses with mixed results. Both TVS and MRI together have a high sensitivity of 97% to 100% respectively in the identification of solid components within an adnexal mass. MRI, however, shows a high specificity. So MRI was shown to be the most efficient second test when an indeterminate ovarian mass was detected in a grayscale ultrasound. High cost of MRI usually precludes its use as a screening modality, and the additional use of a PET scan has been shown to be extremely useful and should be considered as an adjunct to, rather than a replacement for conventional imaging. So a positron emission tomography or PET scan, it has little clinical role in the primary detection of the pelvic mass, and it appears to be promising for its potential to detect the tumor prior to significant morphological changes. That means that, see, when we do an ultrasound, the thing is with PET scan, see, in ultrasound you can make out the mass, you can make out the margins, the fluid, whether it is cystic, mucinous, thick, solid components, everything you can make out. In a PET scan, the thing is PET scan has high potency to diagnose tumors which are even less than 1 centimeter in size, that is around 0.5 to 1 centimeter size of the tumor also it can diagnose. But we don't use PET scan on a routine basis. Why? Because first of all, the incidence of ovarian malignancy is not very high, and secondly, not everybody, it is not like carcinoma cervix where universal screening is done. So only in certain patients who have genetic mutations, if you subject them to a PET scan, you can diagnose at the earliest. That way it is very good. But in patients who already have an established malignancy, already have an ovarian mass, in them there is no use of doing a PET scan, because what you want to see, you're already seeing in ultrasound. There is no extra information that you will get with a PET scan. That is what the slide is trying to tell, that it is promising because its potential to detect the tumor prior to significant morphological changes. When the patient is asymptomatic, when you don't have any complaints, if at all by any chance you are suspecting an ovarian malignancy, subject her to a PET scan. Maybe you will detect any tumor which is less than 1 centimeter also, it will tell you. But once it is already established, a PET scan is of no use. So ultrasound, CT, MRI and PET scan, they have a role to play in the accurate staging of the ovarian malignancy. They also play a role in the monitoring of therapy and detection of recurrent disease. Coming to the tumor markers. So the most common, ovarian malignancy, the most common type of ovarian malignancy are epithelial tumors. And epithelial tumors, the most important tumor marker which comes out from the epithelium of the ovary is CA125. So it is an antigenic determinant with a high molecular weight glycoprotein, and upper limit of normal is 35 units. So in postmenopausal women, there is lower cutoff of 20 international units per ml. So 85% of the patients with epithelial ovarian cancer have more than 35 of the cutoff. Okay. So CA125, the one thing with CA125 is, though it is elevated in ovarian malignancies, it is non-specific. There are many more conditions and many more malignancies where it can be elevated as well. So it is less frequently elevated in mucinous, clear cell and borderline tumors compared to serous tumors, and it is elevated mostly in serous and not in other types of ovarian malignancies. And in other malignancies like pancreas, breast, colon also it can be elevated. In certain benign conditions like even pregnancy, endometriosis, menstruation, tuberculosis, also CA125 can be elevated. Many of these non-malignant conditions are not found in postmenopausal women, therefore improving the diagnostic accuracy of CA125. So now coming to ROCA classification or the ROCA algorithm. This is risk of ovarian cancer algorithm. Basically, CA125 is taken as a tumor marker for epithelial tumors. Now, because the thing is, the sensitivity and specificity of the CA125 is not very good. Alone, it is not very good. So, usually a combination is taken, that is CA125 along with certain other markers, blood or serum markers, and with ultrasound. So, these three together, they have taken and they have told that the overall accuracy of ovarian malignancy with these three components is much higher compared to only CA125 or only ultrasound. So risk of ovarian cancer algorithm basically is based on a study where it was done like this, that all malignant patients were taken and all these three components put together, and they have come out with the conclusion that a combination of these markers is to be taken and not individually. So like I said, one of the limitation of CA125 is that 15 to 20% of the ovarian cancers, they do not express the antigen. And usually other markers in certain other studies, many markers have been taken, but not everything is very specific. There are other malignancies like dysgerminoma, choriocarcinoma, they have particular tumor markers like LDH for dysgerminoma, HCG for choriocarcinoma, and alpha fetoprotein endodermal sinus tumors. So in ovarian malignancies, FNAC should be avoided, because we will, if at all we do an FNAC, we are going to puncture the epithelium and the staging of the disease will be changed. Therefore, FNAC should be avoided, and in a bulky disease may be necessary but usually not recommended. Other investigations like CBC, LFT, RFT and chest X-ray are important. So screening, why is screening important in ovarian malignancy? Firstly, because around 80 to 90% of the ovarian most of the ovarian malignancy, they are chemosensitive, and if given good treatment, there is a high chance of 5-year survival. So screening is important in that aspect, but screening is not done universally, because again the incidence of the malignancy is not so much compared to CA cervix, CA breast, etc. So then what was done in screening is done only in patients who have a genetic mutation, like you have a BRCA1, BRCA2 genetic mutation, HNPCC genetic mutation. In such HNPCC syndrome, in such patients from 35 years of age, yearly screening is done in terms of doing a detailed ultrasound, doing CA125 levels, doing any other investigation if found suspicious. So in such patients it is done, otherwise it is not universally taken up. So in 1994, NIH Consensus Conference recommended that screening should be offered for women with more than 2 first-degree relatives with ovarian carcinoma. In practice, many women with a single first-degree relative are also enrolled in the screening programs. Unfortunately, there are no good screening methods for ovarian cancer at present. Most of them use a combination of a physical examination, CA125 level, and a transvaginal ultrasound. So, Basically, a cancer screening trial was done. It demonstrated that the positive predictive value for invasive care was 1% for an abnormal TVS and 3.7% for an abnormal CA125, which is not very high. But overall combination of this gave a higher predictive value. So there is no role for routine screening in general population, and some follow women with high risk factors like family history, BRCA mutation using CA125 and TVS. So the importance of screening in ovarian malignancy is that there is no universal screening, and this is a common question which is asked in vivas because they expect you to say that okay, everybody you should screen. That is not the answer. There is no universal screening for ovarian malignancy. Why? And you need to elaborate on these. You need to give these as the answer. So coming to risk of malignancy index. So what is this risk of malignancy index is? It is a clinical tool which was proposed where we take the CA125 level. We take three parameters, okay? CA125 levels, ultrasound findings, and menopausal status. So CA125 level, the calculation is ultrasound findings into menopausal status into CA125. So ultrasound finding is you give 1 point for all these. That is, if there are multilocular cysts, you give 1. Solid areas 1, metastasis, ascites, and bilateral lesions. For these 5 components, if they are present in the ultrasound, you give 1 point. If the patient is menopausal, you score as if she's premenopausal, you score as 1. If she's postmenopausal, you score as 3. And the CA125 level, you take it as it is. If at all this RMI, so you multiply everything, and if the risk of malignancy index is more than 200, then the patient has high chance of having a malignancy. And this has a sensitivity of around 85% and a specificity of 97%. So one more study was done where OVA1, that is, it is an FDA cleared blood test which uses 5 biomarkers along with CA125 and scanning. 5 biomarkers, that is transthyretin, apolipoprotein, transferrin, beta-2 microglobulin, CA125. All these are taken and values are evaluated. Any high value is an indicator of malignancy, otherwise no. And OverSure screening tests takes 6 biomarkers. But the thing with these is these are costly, not done routinely, not done in every lab, and it is usually not recommended. So coming to the management of CA ovary. So the most important treatment is, first and foremost, do a complete surgical staging. After you do a staging, optimally do a cytoreductive surgery and then chemotherapy. So in complete surgical staging, full assessment of the abdomen and pelvis has to be done. Random biopsy of the visually negative areas has to be taken and lymph node dissection has to be done. So in surgical staging of ovarian cancer, this surgical staging in ovarian cancer is given in any textbook, and it is given in a pattern that has to be told exactly that way in the viva, or it has to be written in the same way in the exams. There is no doing one step ahead and next step down. No, it has to be in a order. So first we have to vertically incise. From the xiphisternum to the pubic symphysis, a vertical incision is taken. You have to take multiple cytological washings. If at all there is ascites, collect the ascites. If there is no ascites, wash the peritoneum first. So multiple cytologic washings. From where all can we take it from? We can take it from either the peritoneum, from the subdiaphragm, paracolic gutters, or the pouch of Douglas. So random peritoneal biopsies including the diaphragm have to be taken. After this, we have to perform a total abdominal hysterectomy with a bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy, or a unilateral salpingo-oophorectomy can also be done if the patient is in stage 1A or 1C. And as much as possible, remove the tumor intact. Omentectomy has to be done. Complete abdominal exploration has to be done. Finally, lymph node sampling. Lymph node sampling of inguinal lymph nodes, obturator lymph nodes, para-aortic, aortic lymph nodes has to be done. So complete surgical staging, after that an optimal reductive surgery. What is that? See, in stage 1 and stage 2, complete removal of all the disease has to be done. In stage 3 and stage 4, usually the mass will be very huge and it will be adherent to certain parts of the um, it can be adherent to the omentum, to certain other organs. So in these patients, as much as possible, you have to remove the disease to a point that the residual disease which is left after the surgery should be less than 1 centimeter. This is called optimal cytoreduction. So at least we need to achieve that optimal cytoreduction, if not everything. Okay, and so what is the importance of this optimal cytoreduction? The thing is, see, optimal cytoreduction is when you have performed a surgery where there is no residual tumor, or a residual tumor is there of less than 1 centimeter in size. Why it is important is because the least the amount of residual tumor, the higher the survival of the patient. Otherwise the malignant cells will definitely recur, say a matter of 6 months or 1 year. It will surely come back, and treating it that time will be very difficult. So when you do a surgery the first time, it should be your best possible attempt. So other procedures that can be considered that have to be done along with optimal cytoreduction can be radical pelvic dissection, bowel resection, diaphragm or other peritoneal surface stripping, splenectomy, partial hepatectomy, cholecystectomy, partial gastrectomy or cystectomy, or distal pancreatectomy. So these are your other surgeries which have to be done along with your hysterectomy and salpingo-oophorectomy. So they have not written about chemotherapy and follow-up. So a note on chemotherapy: basically chemotherapy, the drugs used in chemotherapy are not undergraduate level and they are not required. But the thing is, after cytoreductive surgery, the patient has to be subjected to a chemotherapy, and chemotherapy we usually give 3 to 6 cycles of chemotherapy at an interval of 3 weeks. Okay, so every 3 weeks for 3 to 6 cycles have to be given, following which a complete evaluation has to be done of the patient, from ultrasound to a CT scan, MRI if required, and CA-125 levels. If they show no evidence of tumor, then tell her to follow up. And what is the follow up of a patient of CA ovary? Initially, the patient has to come to you every month till 6 months of duration. For any symptom evaluation, for history taking has to be done every time she comes, and any mass that she has noticed has to be asked and elicited. After 6 months, every 6 months follow up for 2 years, and every year follow up for 3 years. So every time that the patient comes, you have to take a detailed history. You have to subject her to an ultrasound, and if there is no tumor that is present, then it is a successfully treated ovarian malignancy. So this is the overall of ovarian carcinoma. I think for undergraduate level, this is more than enough. There are certain important points in the history and in examination along with investigations which you have to know. Treatment wise, not very important. What for your level, what you have to know is how to differentiate between a benign ovarian mass, a borderline ovarian mass, and a malignant ovarian mass. The treatment aspect, nobody will expect much out of you, but this much if you read and if you remember, that is more than enough. So thank you very much for your patient hearing.